I am Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is organized by Columbia Global Centers in partnership with the Office of University Life at Columbia. The Global Centers, which operate in 9 cities around the world, are delighted to be hosting this event along with University Life. And this is part of a series of webinars where we try to bring some of the most important voices on some of the greatest concerns that the world faces today. And today is certainly no exception. It's really a pleasure to welcome today's speakers, Jennifer Hirsch and Shamus Khan from Columbia. Together, Jennifer and Shamus are co-authors of the book, Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, which was recently published by W.W. Norton. I'm also delighted to have my good friend and colleague, Suzanne Goldberg, who will be co-moderating today's conversation with me. I will be introducing all 3 speakers more fully in a couple of minutes. You know, a recent review in Science described sexual citizens as profoundly eye-opening. And we are delighted to welcome Jennifer and Shamus to our shared community for a conversation about campus sexual assault and what all of us can do to prevent it. The book draws on ethnographic research that Jennifer and Shamus undertook as part of the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, or SHIFT, Columbia's landmark study of sexual assault on its campuses. Jennifer co-directed SHIFT with clinical psychologist Claude and Mailman. Shamus is one of the project's co-investigators. Between them, over 150 Columbia and Barnard students participated in the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation through interviews. Today's topic, I admit, is a tough one for me. It's tough because as a college professor with over 30 years of experience, someone who has loved being a mentor and teacher to many college-age students, I'm heartbroken that it is necessary to have this conversation. We will be discussing the latest research on sexual assault. My hope for this hour is that by sharing the stories, the research, surprising trends around social dynamics that young people today experience, we can leave this discussion not just with important information, but feeling empowered and hopeful, especially for those in our audience who are students or parents of students. A word of caution to our audience, our panelists will be sharing stories of sexual assault that some of the students in this study endured, and these are very difficult to hear. Now, a word about our speakers. So Jennifer Hirsch is a medical anthropologist and professor and deputy chair for doctoral studies at the Department of Sociomedical Sciences at the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia. She co-directs the Sexual Health Initiative to Foster Transformation, a research project on sexual assault and sexual health among Columbia undergraduates. Jennifer also co-directs the Columbia Population Research Center, which brings together faculty from schools across the campus who work on population health and inequalities. A 2012 Guggenheim Fellow and a 2015 Public Voices Fellow, and a 2018-19 Visiting Research Scholar with Princeton's Center for Health and Wellbeing, Jennifer's published work includes both scholarly and popular writing on health and social inequality. She is the author of A Courtship After Marriage, Sexuality and Love in Mexican Transnational Families, and the award-winning co-authored book, The Secret, Love, Marriage, and HIV. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shamus Khan is professor and chair at the Department of Sociology at Columbia. He writes on culture, inequality, gender, and beliefs. He is the author of over 90 articles, books, and essays, including Privilege, the Making of an Adolescent Elite at St. Paul's School, The Practice of Research, Approaches to Ethnography, Modes of Representation and Analysis in Participant Observation. He writes regularly for the popular press, such as The New Yorker, The New York Times, Washington Post, and he has served as a columnist for Time magazine. In 2016, Shamus was awarded Columbia University's highest teaching honor, the Presidential Teaching Award. And in 2018, he was awarded the Hans L. Zetterberg Prize from Uppsala University in Sweden for the best sociologist under 40. Shamus, it's a privilege to have you.
Thank you.
And Suzanne Goldberg, my dear friend, who is an executive vice president at Columbia in charge of university life. She is the Herbert and Doris Wexler Clinical Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Gender and Sexuality Law. Before I turn it over to our speakers, I just want to remind our audience that you can ask questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we will dedicate some time later on during the webinar to address as many questions as we can. Suzanne, Jennifer, and Shamus, again, thank you for being here. And I'm going to turn it over now to Suzanne, who will offer her perspectives professionally and personally, including as a parent, and help frame the discussion. Suzanne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Safwan. I'm so glad to be here and to be with the three of you for this conversation, which is incredibly important. And I'm grateful to all who have joined us to watch today. Also want to echo something that Safwan, you said at the outset, which is that the subject matter of these that we're talking about, sexual assault on college campuses among young people, can be very difficult. Columbia's global centers are aware of resources. If people have questions or need to find places for support, you can always raise the question in the chat or contact the global centers afterwards, or look for hotlines or organizations that support sexual assault survivors in your communities. And if you can't figure out where else to look, you can always Google Columbia University and sexual respect, and you can get started with the university's sexual respect website. So I want to take us back as we start this conversation to 2014 in the United States. It may be a little bit hard to remember through the experience now of the pandemic, but in 2014, our campuses were full of students, and one of the things that was really causing students to gather in protest was the issue of campus sexual assault across the United States, where students, especially but not only women, were insisting that universities take more responsibility for the levels of sexual assault and unwanted sexual contact and conduct that was happening among students on campuses. So the story, which was truer in some places than others, was that universities hadn't paid a lot of attention, or when they had, that they had, like the broader society, not taken as seriously as they should the complaints of women and others who said that fellow students had committed sexual assault or relationship violence or stalking or other kinds of unwanted sexual contact. And so students gathered and demanded. Media was reporting that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5, depending on the stories you read, 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 students on campus experienced sexual assault. The United States government at the time, the Obama administration, said this is very serious and issued a new set of guidance and guidelines for how universities were to receive and respond to complaints of sexual assault. And so this was a moment at that time where I came into the picture at Columbia as President Rollinger's special advisor on sexual assault prevention and response. And one of the things that I really thought was important as we started to expand and enhance our response efforts and our prevention efforts was to understand what exactly was going on. I wanted a map of the landscape based on the idea that it's very hard to intervene when you don't know what you're intervening in, when you don't understand the dynamics on the ground that you are trying to change. And so I happened to mention this idea of a desire for a map at a meeting where I was sitting next to Jennifer Hirsch, and right afterwards we started talking. She brought in Dr. Claude Ann Mellons, and they brought in Dr. Shamus Khan, and the three of them, and along with a terrific team, formed the group SHIFT that did the research that became the focus for this book. And so I want to thank both of them and the entire SHIFT team for their tremendous work. I'll say more as we continue the conversation about the work that we've done at Columbia, but one thing I want to just note here and then turn it back to you, Safwan, is that universities exist in some part to solve, or at least to address, to think hard about really difficult problems and long-standing challenges. And sexual assault in society, and certainly on campuses, and you know, over time in much broader society, is one of these problems that seems to be intractable. We've seen the Me Too movement call out sexual harassment and unwanted sexual contact, especially not only in workplaces. We see this on college campuses, and the question is, what can we do? What can we do to move the needle, to change things in this very complex problem? There's never one answer. And so universities with people from many disciplines, with energetic students, with thoughtful staff, with faculty, and with colleagues around the world, are able to really put these problems not only under a microscope, but also on a big wall, as it were, and try to take them apart strand by strand. And that is some of what the work of SHIFT really helps us do in advancing this conversation. On a personal level, as a parent and as someone who's worked on these issues for a long time, I'll also say that as we think about these issues, while we think about the massive scale, the tremendous numbers of people who have experienced unwanted sexual assault and other unwanted sexual contact, and the personal and the economic costs of that, it's important never to lose sight of what this means to individuals who have experienced this, and to friends and family who have supported individuals who have experienced assault. And that's also part of an incredible piece of this book, which is it is founded in the individual students and in their experiences on this campus. And these experiences, while they may not look the same on college campuses and university settings around the world, the experiences of students with each other, and of young people with each other, and frankly of adults of all ages with each other, are at the heart of what this book is thinking about. So I'll turn it back to you, Safwan, with that.
Thank you, Suzanne. No, that was really an important framing, and I think what makes this book very, very special is the fact that it relates to real life experiences of actual people who have painfully gone through these experiences, and it paints some really wonderful ideas and strategies and things that we can do as parents, as educators, but also as the potential subjects of sexual assault. So let's talk about the book. And I'm going to turn to you, Jennifer, first, and ask you to tell us a little bit about the book, give us sort of the main thesis of the book, and maybe even share with us what prompted you to write this book. I mean, you've been working with SHIFT, you've been working on these issues for a long time. Why this book, and why at this time? Would love to hear from you on that.
Thank you, and thank you so much. Thank you for creating this space, and thank you to Safwan and Suzanne and the whole Global Center staff for hosting us this morning or this afternoon. So we wrote Sexual Citizens to change the conversation about sexual assault, and not just campus sexual assault, but really sexual assault in general. Suzanne brought us back to that moment in 2014 when campuses in the United States were racked with protest, which was mostly focused on adjudication. And in public health, as everyone in the world knows now, our job is prevention. And so beyond the characterization of campuses as hunting grounds, or the students' concerns about improving adjudication processes to be more fair and responsive, we thought, well, what if we just understand enough about campus sexual assault that we can do better at preventing it? So as Suzanne said, I sidled up to her after that meeting. She really is the heroine of this story. I want to call out not just Suzanne's leadership, but Columbia's extraordinary courage in supporting research at really an enormous scale. For us, it was a perfect setup of complete scientific independence and a really generous amount of resources that allowed us to reframe the problem. And so Sexual Citizens is about prevention. It's about what everyone can do to prevent campus sexual assault. And I will very briefly tell you a story to illustrate that. So Eddie, and obviously all of these are pseudonyms. Eddie told us a story when he came in for an interview that he did not regard as a sexual assault. He seemed to feel sort of aggrieved by the whole experience, as if he had been the one who was inconvenienced. He was invited to a sorority formal, and he didn't really like the girls so much, but it was a very prestigious sorority. So he went along. He was a competitive athlete, so he wasn't drinking. He had an early practice the next morning. She drank heavily, and just in the very abbreviated story, at the end of the night, he didn't seem to really know what to do with her. He didn't want to be rude. He didn't want to send her home in the rain. And so he ended up bringing her back to his room, and where he described to us that he felt obligated to have sex with her because she had invited him as her date, and they hadn't explicitly had a conversation about the evening, about going together as friends. And so he described to us what he called having sex with her as she went in and out of consciousness. She was very, very drunk, in no condition to give assault, to give consent. And that was an assault. And I don't think he would have told us that story if he thought that he had been assaulting her. And so the question that we ask and answer in Sexual Citizens is, what can we do on campus and before kids get to campus to prevent that kind of assault, as well as the many other kinds of assault that young people experience?
Reading the book, I mean, it feels like you're pulling back the curtain, not just on college sex, but on life in college in general. I mean, you talked about Eddie, who's a competitive athlete, dynamics among the students, going to a sorority, expectations. It's a lot of up close and personal stories like this one that you just narrated, Jennifer, of dozens of students. Tell us more about the research, how you conducted it, how you were able to give us such intimate portraits of what it's like to be a young person like Eddie or the woman that he was with that night in college today. I mean, don't forget that we have a lot of members of our audience today who are linking to this webinar from all over the world. And, for some, I think, we can maybe go a little bit further to explain to them what it means to be a college kid on college campus today. And this is really, in all fairness, a question that either you, Jennifer, or you, Shamus, can take on. And maybe, Shamus, I'll actually go to you first to hear from you.
Sure, I'll jump right in here. One of the great challenges with studying sexual assault is that you have to study something that you're never really going to directly observe. So we're never going to see an assault happen. And instead, we have to think, how can we then understand something that we will never see directly? And this is a classic challenge for the social sciences. The solution is really all kinds of triangulation. So designing a study where you gather lots of different kinds of information and you sort of triangulate around the object of interest, which is sexual assault. As you've just said, Safwan, the book is not just about sexual assault, it's also about sex on college campus. Right. And this ties back to Jennifer's first point about prevention. And one of the central themes of the book is that if you're going to prevent sexual assault, we need to understand that moment or those sets of moments or those factors that transform an interaction from being a consensual sexual encounter to a sexual assault, or where someone just walks away from an experience. So like in Eddie's story, when he would just leave that encounter rather than continue to do what he was doing and assault that woman. So, as Suzanne and Jennifer said, this book fits within a larger study of SHIFT. And SHIFT included doing a large-scale survey as well. So that was led by Claudine Mellons. And it was a random population survey of students about their experiences before and in college. And that survey was one of the most comprehensive surveys of a random population survey ever done in a community. We surveyed 2,500 people and we had a response rate of 66%, which is really astonishing. And I'll talk about why we were able to do that. But Sexual Citizens, the book, is narrative stories about students' experiences that are put in dialogue with the results that were presented in a series of scientific papers by the survey team. So we did sort of three major kinds of studies. The first, as you said in your introduction, Safwan, we interviewed 151 students. And this meant spending about 2 hours with them, talking about their experiences before college, their experiences in college, and then their experiences with sex and sexual assault. Jennifer and I did some of those interviews, but we also hired a team of young people to join us who had different racial identities and backgrounds, different sexual identities, and that allowed us to have a kind of broad diversity of our research team so that students could pick who they wanted to talk to. And often they could pick someone who maybe they might identify a little bit more than, say, Jennifer and I, who are a little older and faculty on campus. In addition to those interviews, we did some of them, there were so many stories that we did multiple rounds. So we did sort of 2 follow-up interviews with about 25 of those students. We also ran focus groups with another around almost 200 students. And those were to see how students spoke together about sex and sexual experiences. Now, those 2 methods, the focus groups and the interviews, really tell us a lot about what people say, but they don't allow us to see what people are doing. And often saying and doing can be 2 different things. And so in the research project, I think what made SHIFT and really the ethnographic portion of SHIFT, which Jennifer and I co-directed, so different was that we embedded in the social life of campus. So we also did a third method called participant observation. And Jennifer and I spent time in public spaces like at athletic events, in the public spaces in campus like dining halls, etc. And then in student private spaces, the people that we'd hired, the researchers, went and spent time in those spaces. So we spent many hours in fraternity basements during parties. Our researchers were hanging out with young people in the evenings in the common areas of their dorm rooms. They were on the buses to the athletic fields at Columbia. They were in religious student spaces, so in Hillel and among the Muslim and Christian student groups, seeing about how those communities functioned on campus. And this really gave us what you described, Safwan, as like pulling back the curtain on college life. Part of the aim of this book is to sort of give you a sense of what it's like to be a college student today, in particular at Columbia and Barnard, but really more generally what it's like for these students. I'll say 2 final things about this. You know, what made this research really possible were, first, community boards. We built in members of the Columbia community from the very beginning to the research design. So as researchers, the aim wasn't to come in and say, we know everything, we know how to study this, let us do our work, but instead to bring a range of stakeholders that we met with regularly. So we had 20 students that we met with every Monday morning at 8 a.m. Think about that for college students. It's pretty amazing that they showed up. And they were our guides to campus life, and they really facilitated and bought into the research. And then we had an institutional board, which was made up of different deans and community stakeholders that we were going to present our findings to, so that they felt like the findings that we were presented were not our findings, but everyone's findings, the sort of community findings. And then finally, I'll just double down on what Jennifer said at the beginning. Like, the support of Columbia for this project was incredible. Most people who do research on sexual assault find that their number one opponent is the university that they're trying to study, because many universities just kind of are scared about what researchers are going to find. And what we experienced was like complete scientific independence. Working with Suzanne, you know, the starting point that we all began with was, we can publish anything we want as long as it's scientifically grounded. And that is a really, really wonderful position to be in, because we both had the university saying we want to support this research and the ability to say what we wanted within that research, given what the findings were.
Thank you, Shamus. So, you know, the 3 of you work in this field, and Suzanne deals with this on a day-to-day basis. Jennifer and Shamus, the 2 of you, of course, you know, I've been studying this for a very long time. As I was reading the book, I was fascinated by this concept of sexual geographies, which really I had not been exposed to before. And Shamus, in talking here, you talked about sort of where things occur and the places that students come together and what those geographies might mean. And in Eddie's story, Jennifer, you talked about the sorority, the dorm, and so on. So Jennifer, can you expand on that concept of sexual geographies? What does it exactly mean, and why is it important for us to understand it?
Yeah, so the idea of sexual geographies is something that I first became interested actually doing my dissertation research in the small town in rural Mexico, seeing the plaza as a space for the performance of sexual respectability, and the table dance clubs on the outskirts of town as spaces for licentiousness and sort of the imagined sexual disarray. And so that same idea of space as something that is not just a backdrop, but that actually shapes the kinds of sexual behavior that people engage in has been sort of a through line for my whole career. In Sexual Citizens, we looked particularly at how the social organization of space on campus reproduces unequal power relations. So we illustrate the idea of sexual geographies in the campus context, but obviously it's an idea that's relevant for thinking about cities which have spaces of sexual danger or perceived spaces of sexual danger, or even for our unwillingness to see the home and the house as a space of sexual danger and the sort of silencing of family sexual abuse. In the Columbia context, these are just some examples of what sexual geographies look like. So when you walk into a dorm room, there are 4 pieces of furniture. There's a desk chair, a dresser, and a bed. And so when 2 students who are in some sort of nebulous social relationship walk into that dorm room, they're sort of funneled into the bed to sit down together. And a bed is a piece of furniture that has a social meaning. And so the take home from that is not never go back to someone's room, but rather that that is a moment where an interaction is frequently misunderstood. Or stepping back a little bit from the interpersonal, think about social space in terms of fraternities and sororities. I don't know, many listeners may not be familiar with this, but these are sort of social organizations that students can join. They're not officially part of the campus, but they're recognized in many contexts. They're organized so that fraternities are for men and sororities are for women. And only fraternities serve alcohol at their parties, not sororities. And that's not a Columbia and Barnard thing, that's a national rule. And so what that does is it creates a set of social spaces where men, and frequently older men who are in their 3rd and 4th year at college, are in control of the space and the music and the alcohol. Students can't drink because of the drinking age of 21. Students can't really access alcohol easily in other contexts. And so that social structure produces vulnerability, not in a way that the people who are members of fraternities are bad people, but that the system produces vulnerability. So that's really the underlying message.
Yeah, so I'm picking up some questions, some fascinating questions that are coming on the Q&A, and Jean Golden asks whether sororities and fraternities, that exact structure, Jennifer, that you just referred to, that they unwittingly perhaps contribute to the sexual assault problems that we're talking about. So, exactly what you were talking about in terms of the system, the structure versus how people behave. So what would you say to Jean?
Certainly they are part of a context of vulnerability. I think it's a lot of the conversation around campus sexual assault has focused on fraternities and sororities as a site of the problem. We saw as much variability across fraternities in their social power and prestige as we did between men who are in fraternities and not. And so to us, it feels like there's one configuration of campus sexual assault, the sort of intoxicated campus sexual assault, which working with fraternities and sororities is part of the route to solving the problem. But part of what we do in Sexual Citizens is we depict a much broader range of kinds of assaults than people may be thinking of. So we remind people that assault happens in the context of intimate partnerships outside of that kind of social institution. So the short answer to the question is yes, fraternities and sororities are part of the solution, but they're not. But working with them is not going to get us all the way there. Shamus, would you add anything?
No, I think that's great. Yeah.
Suzanne, if you could unmute.
Yes. I just became that person. Okay, I'll jump in now with a question that builds on the conversation you were just having, which is that the book seems to asks us to insist that we think on two levels, that often sexual assault is talked about as something that one bad individual does to another excuse me, another individual, and that there is, the perpetrator and there is the victim, who often chooses to call themselves a survivor, but the frequent construct is the perpetrator and the victim, and these are two individuals who are just on their own, haven't learned enough, are negotiating their own situation. And it seems to me a key part of the point you're making is it's not only about the individuals, it is about the system in which they are embedded, and a system that supports certain kinds of behaviors, might deter other kinds of behaviors, but most fundamentally that it is a responsibility not just of the two people in the room in a given moment, but also of all of us, right? Of the rest of society in our different structures, whether in institutional or educational structures or governmental structures or family structures, to do the work to change behavior. And so when I read the book, and I really do encourage everybody who's listening to read it, because it is very important and very interesting and engaging as a book to read. It of course is striking as a parent and as an educator to think about all of the young people who I know and interact with. And for everybody who's watching this, if you're a parent or if you care for younger siblings or you care for any younger people, you'll find a lot in here. And I guess what I wonder is what, did you think of parents as an audience for this book? And in addition to parents, who did you have in mind as you're writing the book, right? Who I know you want everybody to read the book, but as you're writing a book, you write for you have audiences in mind. Who are you writing for?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jennifer and I have never been, well, modest is probably the wrong word, but like I would say we're ambitious in the scope of this project, and we really were trying to write to everyone. But I think, three critical audiences we would have in mind. Young people who are in college or really about to go to college. So much of this conversation gets put on what colleges can do, what colleges can do, what colleges can do. And it's critically important to realize that much of this problem happens before anybody steps on a college campus. And so, I'll say two things about that. The first is, in the survey research portion that was led by Claude Mellons, one of the key findings that we had, which is consistent with findings across the literature, is that one of the strongest predictors for being assaulted in college is having been assaulted in high school. And so really, in terms of reaching people, it's not that college is too late, but it's kind of too late. I mean, these conversations need to happen earlier. And so the book is not written in a super academic voice. It's written so that, as part of a high school curriculum in sort of the senior year before young people go off to college, they could read this book and really grasp all of its concepts and use it as a way to think through their own experiences. And that's why there's so many stories through the book, is that the stories are meant so that people can sort of, instead of having an abstract conversation about what's happening, it's a sort of a practical lived experience. So young people are certainly one of our audiences. Parents, as you've said, Suzanne, is clearly an audience. And it's in part because parents are the key vectors for morality in their children. And Jennifer and I don't shy away from a conversation about morality in this book. The title of the book, Sexual Citizens, is sort of a provocation to say that we have a responsibility to develop within young people a sense of their own right to say yes and to say no to sex, but also an obligation in those people to recognize an equivalent right in everyone that they're in a sexual situation with. And so there's a part of sexual citizenship, which is not a me concept, it's a we concept. It is, how is it that I'm treating other people that I'm engaged with, that I'm involved with? And so we think that, you know, part of the responsibility of parents is to raise sexual citizens. That is, to raise people who have a sense of their own right to sexual self-determination and a deep obligation to recognizing other people's similar rights. And then, you know, so much, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Suzanne.
You go ahead. Let me let you finish.
No, I mean, yeah.
Well, maybe this is where you're headed, but I think this will be a question in the minds of many people listening. Okay, so what do we do, right? How do we do that? And I can say at the university level, so what we think about at Columbia, and I know many other colleges and universities think about the same thing, not only in the US, but really around the world, is how do we give a foundation, how do we first of all set out our institutional values? We've taken on sexual respect as one of our institutional values. If our core at Columbia is about community citizenship and what it means to be a member of a university community, one of everybody's responsibilities is to think through the lens of sexual respect in exactly the way you're talking about. It's not only about what I want, but about the person I'm with. We describe this actually not by reference to sex at all, but talking about by acting with integrity toward oneself and toward others. But so institutions can do that through declaring values, through providing education, through requiring education, through having supportive education and training and resources for if incidents do occur and making sure students know where to go for help. What about outside the institutions, right? You're writing for parents, you're writing for students. What are parents and students supposed to do for themselves?
I mean, I think parents, you know, when you raise a child, how many times do you say to your child, don't grab, use your words, right? Like pretty much from their initial mastery of language, you're teaching them about the limits of their own autonomy and desire in relation to other people. And so that message for a 4-year-old, that's a sexual assault prevention message. It's just that parents need to make they need to make the connection, and they need to help their children make the connection. So part of it is a parent project. Part of it, the sexual citizenship really is a community project. So every institution, religious institutions, youth serving institutions, every institution that touches young people on their journey to the university has an opportunity to form their values. And so that is the message of Sexual Citizens, is that part of our failure, and I say our failure in America, in the world, to move the needle on campus sexual assault is because we focused on just telling people what not to do. And that's not really our A game in public health, is lecturing people, right? It's starting where people are and helping them think about what they want to do. So helping young people develop more clarity around what sex is for, and helping them understand that other people are not human scratching posts. They're not tools for them to achieve pleasure. They're actually other self-determining human beings. That's a message that young people can get from a lot of different places, including from reading the book.
So some of the idea then is that, you know, whatever one's background and whatever one's sort of moral starting point or religious starting point with respect to views about sex, right? Something that takes place only within marriage, something that takes place freely whenever two people consent, wherever you come in, I think what you're both saying is the message is come into it recognizing that you're not a solo actor when it comes to sex, and that there, as long as there's another person present, that other person's interests and desires matter. And also that for each individual, it's important to learn how to sort of what one wants and doesn't want, and learn ways to speak about that, and to learn ways to ask others about their own desires or lack thereof, so that there is, so that nobody's going into something with someone when the other person doesn't want to do it. Just to put it very simply, and that can be about sex and it can be about anything else. There's a great video cartoon that many people here may be familiar with. If you're not, you can find it on the Columbia University Sexual Respect website, but it's called Consent and Tea. And it makes the simple point, right, that if you offer someone tea, they say they don't want it, you don't insist that they drink it. You might offer it once more, but you don't insist that they drink it, and you certainly don't try to pour it unwanted into their mouths. And it is this kind of a core concept of thinking about the other, remembering that the other person is a human being, self-determining, as Jennifer.
I mean, I think one of the things.
Let me add, if I may, Shamus, to Suzanne's question, and again, pulling threads from the audience. So, I mean, what Suzanne is talking about can also be taken to the next level in terms of, we're focusing so much on incidents that happen on campus, right? What happens when something takes place off campus? And so Sarah Nakami, asks about sexual geography. How else would the spaces be set up as an embedded measure to prevent vulnerability? How do you deal with also relationships of unequal power and privilege? I mean, here we're talking a lot about students amongst themselves, but we also face a lot of situations where there is, unequal power, if you will, in the relationship. So how do you deal with that? And that question comes to us from Lisa Brush. So as if Suzanne had not given you enough to deal with in her questions, maybe you can deal with those added dimensions as well.
Sure. I mean, I think, Jennifer and I really take an intersectional framework in this book. And what that means is, instead of thinking about sexual assault as just a problem of gender, we think about it as the challenges of gender, but also of class and race and sexuality. And what that means in a sort of less academic sense is that, there are many power inequalities in the world, and that those power inequalities have deep impacts on the likelihood of experiencing sexual assault. And so from our perspective, equality and a commitment to equality, a deep moral commitment to equality, is a sexual assault prevention strategy. So let me make that a little bit more practical. Like, in the book, we tell a story of a woman, Charisma, who was a Black woman who didn't really experience Columbia's campus. She thought of it as a white institution. And what she meant by that was that, like, the party spaces were controlled by men who were white. The music that they played didn't really appeal to her. Many of the men on campus, in her experience, didn't find her particularly attractive, and she experienced that as deeply racialized. And so one of the things she did was she found, through her roommate, a guy who lived out in Brooklyn to meet up with. And, there's a long version of this story in the book, but she ends up out there in Brooklyn with him, and he assaults her. And part of the way in which we interpret that story is not just through his not listening to her when she used her body language to move his hand away, or even later said no, but also how, the racial space of campus drove her off campus. It sort of made that, like, campus wasn't a place where she felt really at home. And so she ended up in a kind of riskier space, a space that she didn't control, that she wasn't a wealthy student. And so for a lot of students on campus, they could have opened up their phone, opened up their, ride sharing app, paid $50 to get home from Brooklyn, and, been out of that situation. She was facing a context where, the trains weren't running, and it was going to be 2.5 hours for her to get home. And, she kind of felt trapped there. And so, one of the things that we think about is how all of these intersecting dynamics, that young man who assaulted her, his upbringing, where he thought of his job as just advancing a sexual encounter, and that's what he was supposed to do as part of a sexual script. That gender dynamic matters. The racial dynamic of campus life, where she didn't really feel as welcome on campus because of the ways in which party spaces were controlled primarily by men who were white, and she wasn't really into the drinking culture. And then again, through class, about how it was that she didn't have the financial resources to easily exit certain kinds of situations. none of this is a causal story. It's not like we're saying, you know, racism or class, it's like directly causally responsible. But we can't understand these dynamics without having that kind of broad perspective. And this, you know, in some ways, this complicates the issue even more than like normal. And, you know, it's already a complicated issue. But in other ways, it gives us an idea that there's no silver bullet to preventing sexual assault. There's no like one thing that we need to do. And if we just did that one thing, like teach people consent education, it was gonna like, it's all gonna go away. Consent education is very important, but it's not gonna get us all the way there. And we need to have this kind of broader perspective of, you know, fundamental equality from our perspective. So racial equality, economic equality, gender equality, and moral equality, where people recognize the moral equivalence of other people that they're interacting with. And to return to Suzanne's question, I think one of the fundamental things that we can do is not silo or silence conversations about sex. So if sex ed and sexual conversations happen in one little class, far removed in, say, high school, or are part of a family conversation of like, just say no, and they're not connected to all of the other moral lessons that we give young people, we're doing them a disservice. So there's lots of education that young people are getting about how to treat others. It's just that because either of silence or shame around sex, or the siloing of sexual education in very peculiar, particular, specific contexts, that the important connections aren't being made by our communities, by our families, and then by consequence among young people in order to transform this campus climate context and really communities well beyond campuses.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's, I mean, there are questions, as I said, you know, they're coming from all over the world, and we're addressing them as we're going along. But I'd like to turn our focus to the world outside of the United States. And Divya Bana writes from South Africa, I think from SA, so I'm assuming that's South Africa and not Saudi Arabia. But Divya says, it's a fantastic book, thank you. So I wanted to make sure I relate that to you. In light of the Jeffrey Epstein case, how does sexual assault combine with material inequalities to produce coercive forms of intimacy? And I think you sort of addressed that, you know, through the story of charisma. But maybe you wanna add to that. But let me also expand from that and say, what can be learned from this and from the research that you've done on U.S. college campuses that may be relevant to schools and other kinds of environments elsewhere in the world? And I'd like to start with you, Suzanne, because you've traveled and you've taken much of this to places around the world, in Santiago through the Global Center there. And when you traveled with me in Jordan back in November, you went to the American University of Madaba and you addressed some of these issues. And we held a workshop also at the Global Center in Amman. So can you perhaps try to relate some of what we're talking about here to environments that exist elsewhere in the world? And then Jennifer or Shamus, if you'd like to add to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add that even although it's online, much like we are today, also had a wonderful conversation with colleagues through the Istanbul Global Center with higher ed institutions there. You know, to me, a core lesson in all of this is these issues go on everywhere. And when they do, when students are assaulted or experience unwanted sexual contact of any kind, it affects their ability to thrive in their educational environment. It affects their ability to complete assignments on time, to think carefully about what's happening in class, to complete classes, and actually in some instances, there's documentation that students drop out. And so for those of us who are committed to higher education, the question is not, you know, should we do this or not? It's only how do we do this? And whether a school is residential or not, and there are plenty of non-residential schools in the United States, meaning that students don't live on the campus as part of the campus, students still interact, right? and that's actually part of the fun, right, of being in a student, is to interact with other students. So we know we need to address these issues. And then the question is, well, what do schools do? And so I'm happy to share a lot, and you can look again on the Columbia University Sexual Respect website, in particular at the Sexual Respect and Community Citizenship Initiative, to learn a lot more about what we're doing at Columbia. But just to be sort of the top line thinking from my vantage point is schools have to articulate values, expectations of students about how students will act with integrity, and to Jennifer's point from earlier, not just integrity in the sense of not cheating in class, but in the sense of how we treat each other in this university or college community. That needs to be messaged to the students. It needs to be reinforced. Students need to have interactive opportunities to learn and ask questions. There need to be, in some sense, resources available to students who experience sexual violence or sexual assault. And whether the school can provide those, I mean, that's certainly ideal in some instances, but all communities in one place or another have resources. And if a school is not providing those on the schools by itself, it needs to make sure that its students are aware of where to go if and when they need help, because inevitably some students will. And you know, there's much more to say about the kind of education that we can do on this. The last thing I'll say here, though, is that one of the things schools can do is cultivate this a sort of a sense of and commitment to an understanding of sexual respect in their student leaders. Because at the end of the day, you know, students are with each other, and faculty and staff are not usually there when these issues are happening or these experiences are happening. And so it's students learning how to navigate spaces, whatever they are, dorm rooms, bars, clubs, parks, navigate those spaces with each other and have the skills to be able to communicate, say out loud what it is they want and don't want. And so that's the kind of conversation that I feel I've been privileged to have with colleagues around the country, hearing what they're doing, sharing what we're doing. And I think these kinds of conversations are another incredible starting point for fostering more of those connections around the world where we share ideas and each benefits from what each other is doing and the insights each other is bringing into this conversation. So maybe Jennifer, I know you've done a lot of work internationally as well, so turn it over to you.
Yeah, and I would start by saying that we're eager to do more work internationally. So we're really hoping that that the Columbia Barnard case study is a jumping off point for further comparative research. So if you want to collaborate on this, please let us know. But I think that connecting sexual citizens to the global conversation about Me Too, it's important to remember who was not going to walk into the interview room and tell us their story. And that was people who are intentionally harming their peers. So you mentioned Jeffrey Epstein, someone who is a serial perpetrator and who intentionally and knowingly is hurting other people, is not likely to show up and tell us their story. And so our focus in prevention is on what we describe as sort of the lower hanging fruit. Remember Eddie. Eddie thought he was having sex, and he thought he was having sex because he had not been adequately prepared for intimate life in a way that was respectful of other people. So that's, if you think about driving, think about, in the United States, we've done over decades, really an amazing job at reducing traffic accidents among young people. And that's because there is a whole system to teach young people how to drive. They don't just grab the car keys and fool around with the car when they're drunk. And, you know, instead there's driver's ed and there's road design and there's even licensing, which is not something that we're suggesting for sex, but there's a whole process through which young people become safe adult drivers. And what our argument in Sexual Citizen is that we need a parallel system. As a parent, it's our hope that young people form satisfying, caring, intimate relationships with other people, right? Well, they need some preparation to be able to do that.
Right. So, I mean, there's so many questions and we're running out of time, and I'm saving one question for the end because it brings the focus back on the two of you actually and the research that you've done, Jennifer and Shamus. But before we get there, maybe very quickly, I mean, there are lots of questions about dormitories, dormitory setup, and also in the context of the fact that we are mostly online for the next academic year, probably for most of it. So, you know, Sarah asks about dormitory setup in general, right? And how else would the spaces be set up as an embedded measure to prevent vulnerability? We have another question from James Darcy, who asks about should single-sex housing be reintroduced? Maria Rabel asks whether sexual assault is expected to go down in a hybrid, mostly online environment. I can also think of that perhaps going in the other direction. And then, so if you could just, maybe try to address those pieces. And Lisa Brush has also written a number of questions, including just sort of, what are the main takeaways of the research for evaluating, improving prevention efforts on campus, especially what she refers to as the hegemonic gender and race-blind bystander approach.
So I'll take very quickly on the dormitories. I think one question is like, what do we do about dormitories? And then a broader way of thinking about this is like, what are the multiple spaces that might be available on campus that can augment what we're doing in dormitories? So, one of the great successes I thought of SHIFT, the broader research project, was, working with a range of Columbia administrators. So Scott Wright, who is the head of facilities on campus, who I think previously never really thought of himself as having anything to do with sexual assault, suddenly realized that like he could be engaged in sexual assault prevention. Like he had a role to play. And so he opened up a space on campus to be open 24 hours on Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights, so that young people didn't have to go to dorms. And so one question about dorms is not to look at dorms, but to ask, what are the spaces available where young people can have intimate moments without beds in the room, or, where they can experience sort of one another without that kind of thing going on. The other is to think about dorm policy where, there's a naturalization that as students get older, they get better space. And so, they have higher lottery numbers as they age through the school. And, what does that do? Like one of the things that it does is it gives older students access to the better social spaces on campus, and so that socialization happens in spaces that they control. And so we might ask what those kinds of policies do and sort of look at dormitories and say, what is it that we can do about dormitory policy that might create greater conditions of equality? Jennifer, I don't know if you wanted to jump in on the other parts of Safwan's questions.
Thank you.
So many parts. No, go ahead, Safwan.
Okay, good. Because I want to get to the final question and then give Suzanne a chance to say anything. But I do want to highlight another comment, actually another question that comes from Bronwyn. I hope Bronwyn Anderson from South Africa, to your point, Suzanne, about the context, right? So Bronwyn writes that the context where culture, patriarchy, race, class, and gender intersect, particularly where parents sanction male power and domination, it's a huge challenge to work with parents to dismantle these sexual scripts. In addition, sex education in schools is considered taboo. And most parts of the world, I don't want to say many, due to the belief that teaching sexuality education is teaching children about having sex. Difficult to get parents to buy into this, and so on and so forth. And this is what Bronwyn says, contributes to the reproduction, sort of, or perpetuation in higher education institutions of the victim-perpetrator gender power relations. And I know that you deal with those issues in the book, and so it's another pitch for people to get the book, but also Jennifer, to your point about doing research together and through the global centers about these issues. I want to thank Bronwyn for the comment that was made. But I want to end with the following question, which from Anna Lee, who says that, talks about how in the book, Jennifer, you talk about how you were in tears after an interview, you made a call to the support team, and so on. And Anna says that she can imagine how difficult the work must be. And she's curious about how the two of you cope personally, emotionally, with the enormity of stories that have no small measure of suffering and confusion. How did you cope as human beings? Put aside the role as academics and researchers. How did you manage the feelings of anger, resignation towards a society that makes perpetration so abundant and instinctive? And what did the two of you learn about yourselves in the process of the research that you conducted for the book? So it's a big question, and we're already over time, but maybe if you can take a minute each to address that, I think it'll be fascinating for all of us. I know for me personally, to hear your response to this.
I mean, I will never forget that interview or that moment of walking up Amsterdam Avenue in tears, wrecked. And what was particularly affecting about that interview was that it was a young woman who had a very extreme story of suffering that included being raped in 9th grade and ending up being trafficked. And I asked her, what did your parents know or do? And she said, they thought I was fine because my grades were good and I was playing sports. And I had, at that moment, a senior in high school I was thinking the whole time we were doing the research, I was thinking about my son going off to college and all, as we pulled back the curtain on all of this suffering. I think that how we made it through was to take care of each other. We started every meeting with a mental health check-in where we could each, and our staff members, everybody talked about how they were feeling. You got to feel the feels. And the only way through is through. And so we talked about how hard it was. And it was really, really hard at times. And what I learned, I knew this before, most research has no effect on the world, right? You produce knowledge, it goes out there and it's ignored. And so I think part of what I learned is that a way to turn the suffering, not just our suffering, but the suffering that we heard about, into change is by doing events like this, by changing the conversation. It's not enough just to produce knowledge. You have to do the work of making sure that that knowledge has a social life in the world so that it leads to something.
So just, quickly for myself on yes to everything Jennifer said. And I have to say that it was really wonderful to be able to do this research with someone else. I don't think either of us could have done it alone. It would have been emotionally really challenging, crippling. The method that we use isn't a method that sort of stands in judgment about people. It's not one that says you should be acting differently. Instead, the stance of ethnography is to try and understand why it makes sense to people to do what they're doing. And so when talking about Eddie's story that Jennifer opened with, that young man who, really raped the woman he was with, but didn't think about it that way. And it never even occurred to him that was happening. Do Jennifer and I have feelings about what Eddie did? Absolutely. But our aim as social scientists was to approach that interaction from a position of empathy. And by empathy, we don't mean total forgiveness, but to try and understand why it made sense to him so that we could transform the sets of conditions that the future Eddies of this world are going to be in. And so much of the conversation about sexual assault is based on silence and fear. And what we wanted to do in writing this book was to sort of, Jennifer and I are dyed-in-the-wool, very positivistic social scientists. We think of ourselves as scientists, and we're pretty rigorous in the ways in which we approach it. But we're also people. And as people, one of the things that we wanted to do in writing this book was to write it with empathy and hope. The aim of this book is you'll read a lot of stories that are really difficult, but at the end, we hope that you have empathy for a lot of the people in the book, and sort of an empathetic understanding of how it's challenging to be a young person today, and hope that there are things that we can all do to make this experience, to make this kind of suffering that we experienced as researchers and hearing these stories and carrying them, and that much more so the young people experienced who had these horrible experiences of assault, that you can have hope, not fear. Hope, not fear. That like, we've got this. There are things that we can do to transform this campus climate.
Thank you. Suzanne, any closing remarks, points you want to make?
My closing point is that I think we could continue this conversation for another hour if we had the time.
Easily.
I do want to add one point that I think comes through in everything that Jennifer and Shamus have said, and that comes through in the work of Shift. And I mentioned it at the outset, but it's the idea that, you know, people often look at sexual assault as just an issue between the two individuals. And there's a question in the chat that was a question I've heard a lot. Well, you know, these are kind of biblical urges, right? Between young people. How do we ever expect anybody to control them? This has been going on forever. And one of the real contributions of this book and of the work is to broaden the frame, right? We ask people to control their urges all the time, right? We couldn't function as a society in any respect if people weren't controlling their urges in respect of what others might do, right? Whether it's driving, we don't drive as fast as we want. We don't grab other people's food off of their plates because it looks better than what we have. We don't do a lot of things that we might like to do. And so for those who are listening and thinking, well, yeah, but this is just kind of a natural part of humanity. I think that the point is not even to have a debate about that. The point is,
right,
what do we cultivate in humanity, and what do we want in a society where we know that if we don't address these issues as parents, as friends and colleagues, as institutions, what we're leaving here with people with is a landscape of great harm. On the one hand,
right,
great injuries to people who have been assaulted, and a set of people who, if they knew, like the story we've been talking, if they knew they had assaulted somebody else, would their own sense of self would be greatly damaged, because that's not the person they want to be. And so my point is, we owe it to everybody, whatever someone's starting point, to take steps, to take a different approach, to have the hopefulness and the concrete skills that enable us to come to a better place institutionally and as a society. And I think coming back to where we are at Columbia, one of the incredible things about being part of any higher education institution is you have a great number of people who are very thoughtful and committed to being thoughtful about complex issues. And this is certainly an example of that. And I'm grateful, Jennifer and Shamus, to both of you, to Claude Mellons, to the Shift team, and Safwan, to you and the Global Centers for bringing us together for this important conversation.
Yeah. No, I mean, just to follow up on something that said Suzanne, sometimes it's okay to think the thoughts, it's okay to feel the feeling, but acting on it is, you know, it's the difference between thinking or feeling and acting. And it is when you act on something, when you act on an urge, is when you get in trouble, when you are being disrespectful, when you are. So I think that sort of self-awareness and being able to differentiate between, what goes on here versus what goes on out there. Now, I just want to say I am in awe, and I really mean this very, very genuinely. I'm in awe of the three of you for the work that you do, for what you put of yourselves into this kind of work, because I was really touched by Jennifer and Shamus, what you talked about in terms of what the experience was in interviewing those people, and being human and having the empathy and having sensitivity and wanting to understand and draw people in, but how difficult that must be. And Suzanne, I know because you and I talk all the time, and I know what you encounter on a day in, day out basis. But I think the world is a better place because of the three of you. And I hope that I know that we've learned a lot. I urge everybody to go out and get the book. And I want to thank our audience for tuning in and for staying on, even though we went over time, something we don't usually do or like to do, and for the great questions that we got from them. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Bye.
all.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.